you're having a great Thursday. I want to talk about inflation. The new inflation numbers came out and they beat expectations. Um, I think what's interesting about the way that inflation is covered is it really depends on who is in office as to whether it has a positive or negative spin. Now, I will say this. Under Trump's first term, inflation was relatively low. There goes Pepper again. He doesn't want to hear anything about inflation. But um, inflation was relatively low. Going into Trump, inflation rose slightly, although interest rates came down. Um, Going into Biden's term, well, actually, coming into the end of Trump's term, you had COVID, obviously, and there was an initial print of money stimulus because a whole bunch of people became unemployed or weren't working for a substantial period of time and they needed compensation of some kind. Now, there's argument as to whether or not that should have happened or whether that should happen at the state level versus at the federal level. That's really neither here nor there. It needed to happen one way or another, just my personal opinion. Now, the secondary stimulus that went out was didn't I would argue definitely didn't need to actually happen. The economy was shut down too long, mostly Democrat-run states, state closed too long. And so the Biden administration cut more stimmy checks and stimulus, um, and that skyrocketed inflation for pretty much a duration of his term. And now the interesting thing is that when it was covered at the time, most left-leaning media was like, yeah, prices are going up, but it's not too bad. Things are still affordable. Like, prices went up substantially. We're not talking about like 2 to 3% inflation. We're talking about like 8, in some cases 9% inflation. And these were for just general things going out. Now, if you look at just energy and food, we're talking about a spike to 5% on those goods over an extended period of time. And the way that I don't think people understand how inflation actually works. So, like, when you have 2% and then you go to 4% and 2%, that's just the rate at which prices are rising. So the lower that number is, that means that they're not rising as fast as they were, let's say, the previous quarter, especially if the numbers are lower in the current quarter versus the previous quarter. But prices are constantly going up. The only way that you see prices go down is if you have negative inflation, which, by the way, we did see for energy costs during COVID. There was a supply glut which drove down gas prices substantially, which also helped with reducing inflation over COVID. People weren't buying things, but also like the input cost for that stuff dramatically dropped. And so it's kind of this perfect storm. But generally, prices are always going up. And so when you have a sustained period of, let's say, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9%, month over month or quarter over quarter, like you feel that, and things become more expensive. Now prices are going up slower under Trump, and to be fair to Biden, they were coming down towards the end of his presidency. But that was because rates went up. And in order to curb inflation, you need to create unemployment. So essentially, all of the unemployment generally that we saw coming into the end of Joe Biden's term and into the beginning of Trump's term, and still a little bit of it's kind of resonating through the system right now, is because of those decisions that were made then. Interest rates were high. They are still high now. And so companies are having to downsize because the cost of maintaining that money or having the money costs a lot more. And so they're trying to create efficiencies. AI is a great way for them to try to create some efficiencies, reduce the labor force. But the entire purpose of the Fed raising rates is to increase unemployment, which which means a bunch of people don't have money and can't spend. And so, yeah. And that's why you see Trump wanting to come so heavily into reducing rates. Now, the thing I find interesting, again, the media covered Joe Biden's um, massive inflation under him as a nothing burger. And constantly were coming out and saying that things were unaffordable. This is unaffordable. Democrats were basically silent the entire time, elected Democrats. And the more left-leaning media was pretty much trying to downplay it, and Democrats were just acting like it wasn't happening, while Republicans and anybody with two eyes were running around with their hair on fire because they're like, oh my God, like eggs and milk and all this other stuff costs like a ton of money. Um, and now, interestingly enough, inflation has gone down dramatically. Again, it is still rising. It is rising slower than it was under Joe Biden's tenure as president. And so, but what you find now is this heavy push from elected Democrats saying, oh, your gas is too expensive and your eggs and milk and your daily, like you can't afford a house. Like they weren't saying any of that stuff under Joe Biden when prices were going up rapidly. And so I have no time for them talking about it now. And the fact is that now at least people's salaries can match the rise in inflation. Like you can't, your salary increases of, let's say, 3 to 4% annually for those who get raises is dwarfed when inflation is going up by, sustained 7, 8, 9%, 6%. Inflation is outpacing wages. Now it's our wage growth, and now it's getting back to that where you can get back to a point where inflation, yes, is up like 4 whatever percent, in some cases 3%, but your salary and your increase in take home is netting that out. So you're not feeling it necessarily in the pocket. And you have all these Democrats coming out and saying like, oh, hair on fire, like, oh, everything's so unaffordable. It's unaffordable because we had such massive inflation under Biden, which is still in the system. And again, prices are rising all the time unless we have actual negative inflation, which hasn't happened in God knows how long. And so you just have this constant kind of uptick. And what you want to do, obviously, is slow that. Now, back to what I find interesting outside of the ridiculous takes from elected Democrats and the more left-leaning media is from the broader finance media, whether it is CNBC or whatever, Bloomberg, or it is the finance YouTubers, of which I follow many. 4 months, they have been talking about rates increasing. Oh, if inflation keeps going up, and we're going to have to increase rates. Now, Jerome Powell just left. Now we have Kevin Warsh in. The entire reason why Kevin Warsh was brought in was because he promised not to increase rates. And the goal is to lower rates, which then creates stimulus and all this other stuff. And you can talk about whether lowering rates is good or bad. If you're trying to buy a house or finance things, lower rates is good. I would love to refinance the high interest rate that I have on my house that I bought 2 years ago. Some of my friends bought houses in over COVID or just before COVID when rates were basically 2-3%. My house is at 7. I do want to refinance, but the difference between 7 and 6, I can wait another year, just pay more on my mortgage in the meantime. I want to go back into the fives, and then it'll be really worthwhile on refinancing. But at any rate, less about me. The reality is that all of these finance YouTubers were out for the last couple months talking about like, oh, rates are going to go up, rates are going to go up, rates are going to go up, and every single time that inflation numbers have come out, they've been lower than expected, and then these people say, oh, well, it's going to get pushed off. It's going to get pushed off. Um, rates are, I'm going to go out on a limb. I don't make a lot of predictions. I try to stay away from it, but this is one where I feel very confident in it. Rates are not going to go up. And anybody out there saying that they are, in my opinion, is left leaning and completely detached from the reality of the current situation. The reason why we have a new Fed chair and Jerome Powell is out is because Jerome Powell wanted to continue to increase rates. That's not great for economic growth. That does the opposite. Again, going back to the point, increasing rates helps drive unemployment, which takes consumer spending down, which then helps try to reduce inflation. And so you can go that route, but you're screwing Americans in the process. The other route is to either keep rates the same and find a strategic time in the future to reduce them, or you end up reducing them up front. Now, while I'm saying that, I will go on a limb and say that rates are not going to increase. Just my general take. I'm putting it out on the limb, and you can save this and come back to it later. But rates are not going to increase during the Trump administration. Rates may stay the same, but they will not increase. My guess is that either towards the end of this year or into next year, rates may actually come down. If you're going to buy a house, keep an eye out for regulation that comes out from either executive orders or through Congress. There's the Housing Act, things like that, that may drive down a little bit temporary relief in mortgage rates. And this actually happened November through March-ish of this year. The rates have gone back up slightly, but they're actually still down. They're still in the 6% range from being in 7% last year. And so those rates have come down, but those rates aren't directly correlated to necessarily the Fed funds rate. But again, I just like these people come out and they give people this advice as a trusted kind of source, as you know, whether it's people on Bloomberg or Fox Business or whatever it might be. But I would say even more specifically, like these YouTubers have just been completely wrong on this. And it's just been interesting to watch because they constantly have to go back and then constantly have to pull back and say, well, now they're estimating that rates are going to go down later this year, not this quarter, or rates are going to go up later this year and not in this particular quarter. But we'll have to wait until the next rate meeting. But in the meantime, they will continue to come out with content stating that in the future rates are going to go up. Again, I will just go on a limb and say rates under President Trump, unless something crazy happens, are not going to go up. And crazy, by the way, isn't, the Iran war is completely separate from any of those kind of decisions. And I will say the only reason why inflation is slightly up, even though it's beating forecast estimates as far as it's lower than it was estimated to be, is because of oil. It takes roughly from the time that oil comes out of the ground to the time that it makes it to the pump is roughly about 4 months. And so we saw essentially this report was factoring in the previous oil prices, which were, by the way, higher. Um, and then you have the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, which was a temporary ceasefire, and then you had ships leaving. Though that oil is still making its way to the pump, and prices will either stay the same at where they are or slightly go down. And even with the slight uptick since bombing has kind of started again, like you're not going to see much increase there. And by the way, tariff inflation, you notice how nobody's talking about it? Because it was never actually a thing. And so, yes, putting out the tariffs did have a one time effect on inflation. It's not consistent. And so, the one thing that's a variable is the input costs, which are energy. The energy costs do more to drive inflation than anything else. And so, the mitigating steps that were taken prior to the bombing campaign in Iran, which is basically taking that supply from Venezuela and making it prior to the US and put it on the market, um, really helped to reduce the impact that would happen by removing a lot of the supply coming out of Iran. You still have Middle East countries that are going to be ramping up production and doing other things, which is going to mitigate that over time. Which again, uh, the peak prices were priced into this particular inflation report. And so again, if you do the math and work back from when the MOU was signed to today, or this week really, those prices are low and they're going to continue to reflect at least through July into August. Um, so again, we'll see. I just generally don't see inflation, getting anywhere close to the Biden era levels, mainly because the oil supply is pretty good right now. The countries that need it are getting it. The demand, while still high, isn't driving the price to sky high. Brent crude futures. Actually, let me check where it is today because I'm kind of interested. I've been tracking it. No, I am not a bot. Thank you. Sitting at 81. And if we look at 6 months, we're still very low. Peak prices were March, April, May, and then dropped off substantially starting June 10th. And then you had a substantial drop all the way through July. So that lower cost oil that's making its way to the pump will be making its way to the pump at the beginning of August. And then these prices are going to stay relatively low and where they're at for a while. Again, I guess my broader point here is that inflation, I would just say, understand that inflation is always going up, and the numbers that are presented are how fast it's going up or the current rate at which it's going up, which you should be just monitoring, right? You want to keep that below, 4%. You want to get it in 3 or 2% range, so that wages are constantly always outpacing the rate of inflation. But unless the number has a negative, um, the cost of things are always going up. And the oil costs that are being, I would say, artificially inflated right now because of tensions in Iran have kind of already made their way through the system. This report kind of reflects that. And so the oil costs generally have kind of leveled off around 70-ish, like $75 to $80 a barrel, which is much lower than it was before. And again, those prices are going to continue to reflect in a lower input cost. for transportation, for food processing, and all this other stuff, and fertilizer, and blah, 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 blah. Like, it all kind of trickles downhill from the cost of oil. And so that has still, even with it being higher today than it was, it's substantially lower than it was at the start of the war. So we'll see how things work out. But you can save this with me making the prediction that interest rates will not increase under the Trump administration. And generally, I would say they're not going to increase as long as a Republican is in. Just my personal take. Although Kevin Warsh is going to be in for a long time, and apparently they can't be fired. The Fed is a completely separate entity, apparently. All other government workers can be fired by the executive branch, but not the Fed. Still kind of interested as to who can actually fire someone in the Fed. Not because of cause, just because they want to replace them. They seem like they're a truly independent agency, another branch of government that has no oversight, which is scary on a couple different fronts. But nonetheless, let me know what you think in the comments section below. Am I off base here? But as always, keep believing that the best is still ahead for America. Peace out.